Is this thing installed correctly? I asked. Are you sure it will cover everything? Yes, Helen, Paul tried to reassure me, smiling at once sympathetically and impatiently. Well, who can blame him for that? We set up a video camera so that it could capture every moment of what was about to happen between us. I had to pay an unexpected but deserved price for the activities to which Paul had brought my attention. I met my husband George at the company where we both worked. I was a computer technician, and he was a salesman. The first time we met was when he brought his laptop to be repaired. He had such a sad expression on his face as he described what happened that I almost burst out laughing. By the time he finished telling me what the problem was, I had already sorted it out. He ran out of the office, clutching the laptop to him as if it were his child. I laughed, shook my head, and immediately forgot about him. 2 days later, he called me. Hello, Helen, this is George. Who? George Thomas. When I remained silent, he added, I brought my laptop the other day. You quickly solved my problem while I was still trying to explain to you what it was. Oh yes, now I remember. You didn't tell me your name. I know, and I quickly left you without doing the most important thing. I didn't say thank you. All I can offer in my defense is that I had 2 weeks of orders on this laptop that I needed to finish. Although I know that hardly excuses my bad manners. I was simply shocked. Most of the people who brought me their equipment grumbled all the time, as if it was my fault. Will this take long? Or, what do you mean you have to order parts? And, is there anyone here who the hell knows what's going on here? That's what I'm used to. Just not a thank you. Wow, please. He hesitated and cleared his throat twice before muttering, Helen, I wanted to ask if you would allow me to make amends. I'd love to go with you, George. Okay, I know this sounds like some kind of sassy woman, but it's actually not true. I was just afraid that if I waited for him to finish, I would become too old to get dressed without the help of a nurse. Besides, as immersed as I am in my work, my last date was 6 months ago, and labeling it a disaster was actually reporting it as better than it actually was. There was another vibration on the line, just enough for me to think, brilliant, Helen. That was not what he was trying to say at all. Are you practicing making yourself look like a fool for the most part? Fortunately for my vanity, the silence was broken by warm laughter. Great. How about Friday night? Shall we have dinner somewhere nice but not too fancy, and then see what happens next? I gave him my address. I'll be ready by 7. On Friday evening, I was looking at myself in the mirror for the 100th time when the doorbell rang. I was wearing a good old black dress just above my knees, paired with low heels and tights. I actually didn't really like wearing dresses, and I definitely didn't like heels. Boots, which I wore in my early 20s before going to engineering college, and sneakers were my favorite shoes. Not that I'm butch, but you understand. I just prefer comfort. George looked very handsome as he led me out. We went to a nice restaurant in the city center and ate well. After that, we went for a walk along the small shops and boutiques of the historical center of the city just to look at the windows. It seemed like we were having a hard time finding a common language. We talked mostly about work, without delving too deeply into personal problems. I really don't know why. I felt that there was some kind of subtle connection between us, but for some reason neither of us could grab onto this thread and get closer. In the end, we decided that enough was enough for today. On the way home, George's car slowed for a moment as we passed the local sports complex. I looked at him and followed his gaze. He was looking at the sign announcing that the local Class A minor league baseball team would be playing its first game tomorrow afternoon. Being the gentleman he is, George walked me to the front door. There was an awkward silence. Then George wished me good night and walked down the path. "George, wait!" I shouted after him. He stopped and turned around. I swallowed and walked over to him. "Today didn't go very well, George, and I don't know why." "Let's try again. Instead of getting dressed and going to a restaurant, how about jeans, hot dogs, and a ball game tomorrow?" He grinned, and his face brightened. "First serve at 3:15. Shall I pick you up at 2 so we can watch batting practice? Agreed. I kissed him and rushed to the door, the smile on my face as big as his. The morning dragged on slowly. During the day, well, I started to fall in love from the very beginning. We had the promised hot dogs, slathered in mustard, ketchup, and sauce. We had beer in foamy wet paper cups, cheesy fries, and popcorn. Every bit of it went straight to my thighs and buttocks, and I enjoyed it all. George had to dress up to look like a traveling salesman when he traveled. But here he was, a guy in jeans and a sports shirt. We exchanged life stories and were struck by the similarities between our experiences in high school, the 3 years between that and college, and what we considered important in life. We screamed and jumped up and down a lot. Our seats were right at first base, and the game was so-so until the 9th inning, when the home team turned the score and won. Rejoicing, we jumped into each other's arms. After this hug, our first kiss began. We didn't interrupt him until the cries of "get a room" did not become exceptionally loud. The road to my house flew by unnoticed. We kissed all the way up the driveway, through the door that George managed to slam behind us, and all the way down the hallway to my bedroom. Our trail was littered with shoes, jeans, and shirts. We fell on the bed. Our sex was amazing. I rewarded him the same way he rewarded me. With cries of pleasure, thank God I was protected. Why I continued to take birth control during a long drought of celibacy, I don't know, but it paid off. When it was all over, I lay on his arm, lazily looking at the rotating ceiling fan. 2 months later, we moved in together. 6 months later, they got married. On our honeymoon, we visited South and North Carolina, spending time there and enjoying the places we unknowingly shared in our college days. When we returned, we found an apartment to make it ours and settled into a happy home routine at work and at home. The only fly in the ointment was the business trips that were mandatory for George. But he made great money and enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed my work. We were both naturally frugal, so we were able to save a decent amount each month. We would soon be able to afford a down payment on a house, and we discussed the exciting possibility that I could eventually quit my job and give us a baby. With George's more outgoing personality, I became more involved in the company's social activities. I played softball on a company-sponsored mixed team. Unfortunately, George missed many games due to his duties, but he always came when he was home to cheer for me as the most attractive first baseman I had ever seen. The director of corporate relations, and also a pitcher on the softball team, was Paul Weinkamp. A tall, well-built bachelor, he was the object of close attention from single women, and even one, I was sure, was married. Who he dated was of no concern or interest to me. One day, he collapsed on the bench after a well-played game. He took 2 bottles of water from the refrigerator and offered me one. I gratefully agreed. "Where is George?" "I think he's in St. Louis today." Paul shook his head. "George is a real provider, but I bet you wouldn't want him to spend so much time traveling. If you were my wife, I wouldn't let you out of my sight." "Well, I know what it's like there. My ex-wife worked in the sales department and was always disappearing somewhere. Then I found out that she did not spend these nights on the road alone." He sighed heavily. "You never expect this to happen to you." With these words, he stood up and walked to the parking lot. Well, this was unexpected. I couldn't bear to think that George might not be 100% faithful. However, Paul's ex-wife surprised me. After all, he was quite handsome and, I was sure, received an excellent salary. Why would anyone deceive such a tasty prize? As the weeks passed, I began to feel like I was seeing Paul more and more often. He stopped by my office from time to time, and on several occasions I was specifically asked to install upgrades on the corporate relations department's computers. And of course, we saw each other at every match. He never missed an opportunity to ask about George, and there was always a certain suspicion in his words. Although, given his own history, I could understand his thoughts, and undoubtedly George behaved decently. More than once, I began to speculate about this, but Paul always seemed to feel what I was feeling and changed the topic of conversation, usually turning it towards me. He often complimented me on my ball skills as well as my extreme attractiveness. With assurances that he meant nothing reprehensible, he made several slight but flattering allusions to my appearance. I returned home more than once to look at myself in the mirror. Obviously, he saw something that I didn't. I even liked Paul's attention. We have become, if not friends yet, then at least close colleagues. He said it was nice to have someone to talk to about his bad marriage. One day he asked me, "Helen, can I ask you something?" "Well, can you ask, Paul?" He chuckled, appreciating my wit. "Why does George call you Bam?" "This is a nickname. It has to do with what we learned about each other when we first started dating." I laughed. It's one of those things that only makes full sense when you've shared the same experience. Otherwise, it's meaningless. Paul did not insist on clarification. About a month later, the company held its big Independence Day celebration. I was looking forward to it being a 3-day weekend for all of us. Unfortunately, George called me from Dallas the night before and said he wouldn't be able to get home in time. I reassured him that everything was fine, that I would miss him, and that I loved him. The party coincided with the league championship game. Paul, of course, asked where George was, and I explained. He said almost nothing, just chuckled. He had a very strange expression on his face, half sad, but still with a tinge of some anticipation. 2 weeks later, when George was traveling again, Paul called me into his office. This time, he closed the door. He pointed to the sofa and sat down next to me. "Helen," a pained expression flashed across his face, and he hesitated. "I'm very sorry, but as a friend and colleague, I think you have a right to know this. The night George skipped the office party that he unexpectedly didn't show up to, I'm afraid that—" He paused, and I could have sworn he choked back a sob. "I'm afraid that I have evidence that George is having an affair. This is impossible," I almost screamed. "I know, I can't believe it either, but—" He turned on the TV in the corner of his office, then turned on the VCR. "But there's this. Please don't ask me how I got it. It was a film for adults. A man who looked like George, at least from the back, was having passionate sex with a blonde." I slowly leaned forward on the couch, listening and watching what was happening. The sound came from the TV and his face appeared on the screen. The image flickered and blurred for a moment, but it was George's face. Paul turned off the TV and put one arm around me. "I'm so sorry, Helen. I know it was terrible. I cannot believe it. I just can't believe someone could stoop so low. I know, Helen, and I didn't believe it when my wife betrayed me. But it turned out to be true then, just as true as it is now. I was very calm." "What are you suggesting, Paul?" "I don't believe in revenge, but someone who behaves like this should get what's coming to them." I could have sworn there was a look of anticipation in his eyes. "You're absolutely right, and I know how to arrange it." I listened to his proposal and agreed. So, 3 days later, I met him in a well-known hotel room. He had already set up video equipment to record the two of us having sex. "I don't want to do this to George," Paul said sadly. "But you have to teach him a lesson." "I agree," I smiled. "I'm glad you are here. Without you, all this would be impossible." I took a deep breath as Paul turned on the video camera. He directed her across the room to a king-sized bed with a bucket of champagne next to it. He focused it on the foot of the bed. At his nod, I entered the frame at the same time as him. I put my arm around Paul's shoulders and smiled at the camera. "George, Paul told me something very indecent about you. He told me all about the cutie you have on your side. He was kind enough to explain what you do when you're out of town and talk about your boasts at the office. I tried not to believe it, but the last straw, my love, was the tape he showed me. I can't stand this. Confidence. It's all about trust. George, you and I have talked about this enough for you to know what we're basing our relationship on. This is a slogan for us that extends to our friends and colleagues. How someone can behave like this without the slightest concern about the impact it might have on another person is beyond me." I turned to Paul and wrapped my arms around his neck. "Paul, could you say something to George before we start?" When Paul looked at the camera, his face broke into a shitty grin. "George, old man, I'm very sorry that I'm doing this to you, but it's for your own good. Maybe after this, Helen will be able to forget what you did to her." He continued to smile maliciously as I ran my fingers through his hair. He moved closer to me. I stood on my tiptoes and whispered in his ear, loud enough for the camera microphone to pick up the words. "I want to share a secret with you, Paul." George's nickname for me. BAM is actually an acronym that stands for Big Ass Aggressive Marine. I stepped back slightly and punched him in the groin. The floor suddenly turned pale and began to slowly bend in half, and I continued. "Of course, it's not politically correct, but it is a term used by male Marines to refer to female Marines. It's half joke, half truth." I saw Paul fall to his knees, clutching his dignity in his hands. "My instructor was right," I noted thoughtfully. "Nothing attracts attention like a good blow to the groin. I don't remember this being discussed in the hand-to-hand combat course, but I felt that it would make me very good." With that, I raised one leg and kicked Paul in the ass. "You are a stupid bastard. Did you really think I was stupid enough to fall for this? To blame my husband just because of rumors and hints, which, I am sure, you yourself began to spread? I love him, idiot." I spoke in a pompous tone as I followed him crawling towards the door, stopping only to make sure the camera was still looking at us. "I knew you were up to something ever since you came up with the idea. This may have worked before, but not with a couple who communicate daily." That same evening, I found out about this hotel room. He was too tired to drive home after an 18-hour day. Didn't you think that he would call me from his room and tell me? And this is the so-called video. My God, I'm a computer worm. This attempt to transplant George's face into someone else was ridiculous. I noticed this in 2 seconds. Paul managed to reach out and open the door. I bent down and grabbed his belt. "I'm not done with you yet, rat. I can't believe your nerve to make me think that George was having an affair and that you wanted to sleep with me. It's probably all for the thrill of conquest. Well, you picked the wrong girl and the wrong guy. Always faithful is not a motto." I take lightly. I let go of his belt, put my foot on his ass and pushed. He stretched out in the hallway, and I threw his keys after him. Speaking of trust, George trusted me to handle this matter myself. Paul's eyes widened in shock. "However, as soon as I call him, he will probably start looking for you. He's also a former Marine, if you haven't figured it out already, and I don't think you want to be in the same city with both of us holding a grudge against you. Why don't you move to Muhosransk, Egypt, before we find you? You have as much time as you want, but I would advise you to leave in 24 hours. I kicked Paul's ass again, but missed as he ran down the hallway. 2 hours later, George and I were snuggled up on the bed in our hotel room. The remains of the minibar's contents were scattered across the floor. I laid my head on my husband's chest. God, what prices are here? I looked up as George tilted his head back and emptied the contents of a small bag of nuts into his mouth. Yes, it was very nice of Paul to put the number on his credit card. We'll have to thank him properly if we ever see him again. By the way, how are you? Relate to seeing him again. We never saw Paul again. By the time we got to the office 2 days later, he had already quit and left for parts unknown. No one seemed upset about him leaving, especially when it turned out that I wasn't the only married woman he'd hit on. Apparently, he had a penchant for seducing happily married women, I guess to get back at all of us for what his ex-wife did. Although I was very grateful to him for one thing. 9 months and 3 days after our selfless 48-hour celebration, I gave birth to my daughter. It was a pure joke on our part to call her Helen Paula Thomas. She was our first, but not our last. We still embarrass everyone at every baseball game we all attend together.